Have you ever heard of someone turning themselves into the police not because of guilt, but because of fear of something even darker? Imagine a cold, methodical man with a seemingly clean past, calmly walking into a police station and saying, "I asked to be arrested. This is the only place they can't catch me." This was the confession made from inside prison by Elliot Grayson, a respected professor, now accused of a series of murders that no one has ever connected, until he reveals every detail with surgical precision. This is a true story, based on official records, interviews, and reports that have never been shown on TV. A mysterious, disturbing case where every step of the killer seems to have been calculated decades in advance. What you are about to discover now may surprise you. There is something behind these crimes that defies logic, science, and even faith. Watch this video until the end, and you will get goosebumps. Because perhaps, for the first time, prison was not a punishment, but a hiding place. And when you understand what really motivated him, you may wish you had never pressed play. But now it is too late. Let's go back to the moment when it all began. On the morning of April 12, 2014, the small town of Flagstaff, Arizona, woke up to a scene that even the most experienced police officers could not explain. The body of a young woman without documents was found leaning against a dry tree on the edge of a vacant lot. The position was almost symbolic. Hands crossed over the chest, eyes closed, with no visible signs of violence. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Just an eerie calm hovering over the crime scene. The medical report would later indicate death by cardiac arrest, with no internal or external injuries that could justify the collapse. A case without answers, filed as an undetermined event. But there was a subtle and crucial detail that went unnoticed by everyone except someone observing from afar. The presence of a dried flower between the victim's fingers, a species that only bloomed in regions near Inverness, Colorado. It was like a signature, silent and cruel, left only for those who knew where to look. Years later, Elliot Grayson would include this case in his own dossier, handed over to the police on the day he surrendered. In that folder, organized like a war archive, were dates, maps, photos, and observations. The victim's name? None. But the place and time were there, and the flower dries too. According to Elliot, that was the first warning, and not his. What disturbed investigators most was not the brutality of the crime, but the lack thereof. Elliot Grayson seemed to fit no profile. A college professor of English literature, he led a methodical and solitary life. A widower since the age of 31, he lived alone in an isolated house on the outskirts of Tucson. He had no children, no close relatives, no history of violence, and he did not attract the attention of neighbors, students, or colleagues. He paid his taxes on time, always shopped at the same market, and maintained an almost monastic routine. But there was something wrong with the silence. Inside his house, experts found more than 1,000 carefully catalogued books, many of them about forgotten rituals, ancestral cults, and esoteric manuscripts. The walls of the basement were lined with lead sheets, sealed with layers of industrial silicone with no visible ventilation, an expensive construction unnecessary for any ordinary person. When questioned about it, Elliot calmly replied, "It's the only place where you can hear nothing. Absolutely nothing." What was most strange was the lack of any medical, school, or legal records for Elliot before he was 10, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Not even a valid birth certificate had been located. For the system, it only came into existence after being adopted by a couple who died in a fire shortly afterwards. His past was a shadow, and he seemed determined to keep it that way, until he started writing. In his notebooks, found locked inside a cast-iron box, were references to specific astronomical dates, lunar patterns, and eclipses, as if he was marking a cycle, and each date coincided with a death. Inside the black folder that Elliot Grayson voluntarily handed over to the police was something that chilled the blood of even the most seasoned investigators. A dossier with meticulous records of 6 murders spread across different states over the course of 9 years. Names, maps, exact times, photos of the bodies before the police even arrived at the scenes, all organized with almost surgical precision. But most disturbing was the pattern that no one had noticed until then. The deaths always occurred during specific astronomical events, mainly partial solar eclipses or seasonal transition dates. There was no repetition of method, weapon, or location, which made it difficult to try to connect the cases. But Elliot saw what others didn't, or heard. Among the documents were notes that read like confessions, but without remorse. On one yellowed page it read, "The alignment of light and shadow opens. Blood seals." In another, "If I don't act, they will cross." None of these statements made any legal sense, but the pattern was there. All of the victims had been declared natural causes, accidents, or undetermined deaths. No official report mentioned homicide. And yet Elliot claimed to have committed each one. More than that, he seemed proud. When questioned, he said simply, "You didn't save anyone, I did." The first to realize that something was deeply wrong was Special Agent Michael Lorne. At the time, he was investigating a separate case in Seattle. A woman was found in her bathtub, dead without signs of violence, with a serene expression on her face. The water was clear, with no signs of drowning, and the clock in the house had stopped at 3:03 a.m., the same time of death recorded by the coroner. Lorne filed the case as a sudden death, but something was bothering him. 3 weeks later, he received an anonymous letter. The paper was old, the handwriting was firm. There was no return address, just the sentence, "She dreamed of them before she left. You will too." From then on, other letters began to arrive, always written by hand, always with dates prior to the deaths that would come. Descriptions of victims who had not yet been found. Some mentioned names, others just locations. All were fulfilled precisely. Lorne took the documents to the FBI, but was removed for emotional imbalance. Colleagues said he was obsessed, but there was something in his eyes, real, contained fear, as of someone who has seen something that cannot be explained. Over the next few years, Michael devoted himself to studying the patterns. He was the one who noticed the dates that coincided with eclipses and solstices. He was the one who mapped the victims who had never been connected, but he was also the one who lost the most control. In his diaries, which would only come to light after his disappearance, there were dozens of drawings of featureless faces with mouths sewn shut, and a phrase repeated more than 100 times, "They cross when no one is looking." The first time Michael Lorne walked into the maximum security room at the state penitentiary to interrogate Elliot Grayson, the air seemed thicker. No sound came from the other side of the thick glass. Elliot sat motionless, his hands on the table, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. There was no anxiety in his eyes, no guilt, just a kind of uneasy peace. When Michael introduced himself, Elliot smiled slightly and said in a steady, almost indifferent voice, "I'm here. You took your time." For the first few minutes, Michael asked pointed questions, dates, names, motivations. Elliot answered as if reciting a poem he knew by heart. The information matched confidential records that had not even been released to the press. He knew things that no one else did. But when the agent confronted him about the real reason behind his surrender, Elliot changed his tone. "Do you believe in limits?" he asked, staring at Michael with absurd calm. "Physical limits, moral limits," the detective replied. "No, the others, the ones who separated what was ours from what should never have been." Michael felt a chill run up the back of his neck. This wasn't acting. Elliot wasn't trying to impress. He was just making a statement, like a teacher in front of an ignorant student. Then he added, "If I were out in the next eclipse, they would pass right through me." Michael tried to force him to explain who they were, but Elliot retreated into silence. His eyes, previously fixed, now avoided contact. He only repeated more quietly, "Here, they don't touch me." That night, Michael had his first nightmare. A dark, endless hallway, and voices whispering names he didn't recognize. When he woke up, there were red marks on his palms, as if he had squeezed something extremely hard. He didn't tell anyone. But he knew that the interrogation had opened a door, and it didn't seem to close anymore. In the days following the interrogation, Michael Lorne could not get the name Elliot had muttered during the conversation out of his mind, Inverness. At first he thought it was a metaphor, until he decided to investigate. He discovered, buried in the archives of a rural Colorado library, an extinct village called Inverness Hollow, consumed by a forest fire in 1978. Few records remain, no official images, but one name stood out in the county records: Elliot Grayson, resident between 1986 and 1989, years that officially did not exist in his life. Michael traveled to what was left of Inverness, just ash, twisted roots, and a concrete slab overgrown with vegetation. All that remains of the old St. Ethelred Children's Home, a clandestine psychiatric institution run by a cult called Four Faces of the Veil. According to classified records from a federal agent at the time, the site was being investigated for rituals involving eclipse-sensitive children. The wording was vague, but the accounts included sensory deprivation sessions, chants in archaic languages, and a recurring symbol, a circle divided into 4 parts with a slit in the center. The same symbol was scrawled on the back cover of one of Elliot's notebooks. Michael searched every inch of the ruins. Among the rubble, he found a charred piece of wood, marked with the initials EG carved with a knife, and next to it was a broken iron padlock. When he returned to the car, he noticed something impossible. The clock hands had stopped at 3:03 a.m., the same time the Seattle victim had died. Even with the engine off, the radio turned on by itself, and before it burned out completely, it played a single muffled recording. He was marked. The cycle repeats itself. Michael returned to Tucson with the conviction that something had been left behind in that place. Not for Elliot, but for what happened to him. And you felt like time was running out. She was the mistake in Elliot Grayson's math, the only victim who didn't die. Her name was Abigail Monroe, now 29 years old. In 2016, at the age of 20, she was found wandering barefoot on an interstate highway in New Mexico, covered in dirt and with superficial cuts on her face and hands. Disoriented, she kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "I saw inside." At the time, she was hospitalized under the diagnosis of a psychotic episode. No complaints were filed, no connections were made to other cases, until her name appeared, discreetly, on one of the pages of Elliot's file. But unlike the other victims, next to Abigail's name, there was only one word written in red: marked. Michael was granted permission to visit her. Abigail has lived for 7 years in complete voluntary isolation in a dark room in the psychiatric ward of a private clinic in El Paso. The lights are permanently turned off. The only condition she imposed on accepting any human contact was, "Don't enter with light. Light attracts attention." Michael walked in. In the pitch black, he felt her breathing before he heard it. Abigail didn't say Elliot's name until the detective mentioned the word Inverness. She froze. Then, in an almost childlike voice, she whispered, "I'm sorry. They came before him. He just opened it, but he tried to close it." Michael asked what she meant, but the answer was even more disturbing. "He tried to kill me, not to shut me up, but to stop me from going out the door." Michael swallowed hard. This was beyond criminal logic, but Abigail wasn't making it up. She'd described details of Elliot's basement with precision that had never been revealed. She'd mentioned sounds, textures, and a low melody that came when the eclipse touched the ground. Before the session ended, she whispered, "I still listen. When I am silent, they whisper my name." Michael left that clinic with a suffocating certainty. Abigail was not a survivor. She was the beginning of something that was still in motion, and the time for silence was ending. Michael Lorne returned to Tucson with more questions than answers. With each piece of the puzzle he put together, the final picture seemed less human. Seeking to understand what was really going on inside Elliot Grayson's house, he requested full access to the seized materials, including audio recordings made in the sealed basement. The files were in an old format, stored on DAT drives that had been nearly destroyed. An FBI sound engineer worked for days to restore the files, and what they heard was not only disconcerting, it was unclassifiable. The audios had dates and times corresponding to the early mornings before each death recorded in Elliot's dossier. They always started the same way: heavy breathing, slow footsteps on the concrete floor, and then absolute silence. But the silence was broken by something. That made no sense. Metallic noises that seemed to come from within the structure of the house, creaks that reminded one of old doors opening and closing. Then a low, continuous, almost imperceptible frequency, which caused dizziness in the agents who listened to it with headphones, and then to voices, phrases in corrupted Latin, words in unknown languages, and finally, a clear sentence, spoken in a deep, dissonant voice. "He is our cycle. He is the ninth." The analysts tried to simulate the echo of the recording to discover its acoustic origin. The result was frightening. The frequency did not match any physical structure in the basement. For that sound to be captured with that kind of reverberation, the room would have to be 3 times larger, or be partially open to a shapeless space. When confronted with the recordings, Elliot just smiled and said, "Do you still think I was the one who chose the place?" That same night, 3 agents involved in analyzing the audio recordings reported identical night terrors. A hollow-eyed entity standing at the edge of the bed, repeating the same whispers from the audio recordings. The recording was sealed, but Michael kept it, because deep down, he knew that voice wasn't Elliot's. It was something still waiting. The investigation led Michael to cross a nearly forgotten name in the CIA's confidential files: Penumbra Project, a clandestine initiative from the 1960s focused on exploring psychic phenomena and extra-physical interactions in astral convergence zones. At the center of this project was a man who had left the agency in 1971, Harland Vexley, believed missing since the Inverness Hollow fire. Leaked documents suggested that Vexley had founded a secret community based on forbidden texts from the Babylonian tradition, mixed with fragments of an archaic language with no known roots. The sect called itself the Four Faces of the Veil. According to records, its members believed that there were fragile points in the fabric of reality, especially during certain celestial alignments, and that on specific dates, these fissures allowed the passage of entities that did not belong to our plane. These entities had no fixed form, only intention, and their only language was instinct. The rituals performed in Inverness had a macabre purpose: to sacrifice mediators, sensitive people connected since childhood to these dimensional cracks, to close the portals before they expanded. Elliot, then 9 years old, was one of them. Michael read, dumbfounded, the report of a surviving witness of the cult who had been hiding in Mexico for decades. The handwritten text read, "He endured 3 nights without speaking. The blood would not come out of his skin. They accepted him as a seal, but the fire came before the end." That phrase echoed Elliot's words precisely during his first interrogation. The fire in Inverness was no accident, it was containment. Michael began to realize that the murders were not just crimes, they were interruptions. Each death coincided with one of those sensitive dates, and Elliot did not kill for pleasure or on impulse. He was following a pattern that had been established for a long time, a pattern that he might not have even initiated. The question that was beginning to grow even more frightening: what would happen if he stopped? It was in the early hours of October 2nd that Michael Lorne began to lose control. He was alone in the house, reviewing the reports from Inverness when the lights flickered briefly, 3 times. The clock in the living room stopped at exactly 3:03, the same time as the other occurrences, always ignored in the official reports. At that moment, the silence became heavy, as if the air was saturated. From the dark hallway, Michael heard a faint sound like slurred breathing. He got up cautiously, gun in hand, but found no one. However, there was something new on the wall of the guest room. Words written in a dark substance, perhaps. Blood, perhaps something older. The sentence, "You saw too much." The following nights, the same phenomenon repeated itself. The bathroom mirror would fog up for no reason, even with the cold water. Once he found his name scrawled in the steam in tiny, shaky letters like a child's. Michael began to record everything in a personal diary, but the pages would mysteriously be torn out. He locked his room with a key, but the lock would be damaged in the morning. The nightmares intensified. He dreamed of an endless hallway, full of steel doors all open, all groaning as if they were breathing. And at the end of the hallway, standing in the dark, Elliot Grayson, motionless, with his eyes sewn shut and his mouth open in a silent scream. Michael tried to distance himself from the case. He excused himself, but the voices did not stop. They came low, almost imperceptible, amid the noise of the electronic devices, in the white noise of the switched-off television. Voices calling his name. Voices asking, "Are you going to open it or not?" He went to the penitentiary one last time, determined to end contact. But when he walked into the visiting room, Elliot was already there, smiling. "They like you. You've been marked too. You just don't know it yet." Michael stood up, but before he left, Elliot added almost as a warning, "When the eclipse passes, someone has to seal it, or they stay." From that day on, Michael never slept with the lights off again. The eclipse announced for October 14th attracted national attention. Headlines blared the rare astronomical phenomenon that would cast a swath of total shadow across the country. But for Michael Lorne, the date wasn't cosmic beauty, it was omen. He knew what was coming. The tension was unbearable. His notebooks were filled with patterns, calculations, and notes that had been cross-referenced with Elliot's records. There was a prediction there, hidden among the scribbles and symbols. The next victim would be someone directly linked to the investigation. On the eve of the eclipse, Michael disappeared. His car was found on the side of Highway 191 in a desert area between Tucson and Apache County. It was clean, with no signs of a struggle. The gun was still in the glove compartment, but on the passenger seat was a sealed envelope with no addressee. Inside it was a single photo, a drawing of a circle divided into 4 parts with a slit in the center. Next to it, handwritten, "Last seal, last chance." The next day, at 3:03 a.m., a prison guard found a body in the abandoned dining room of the North Wing, an area that had been deactivated for more than 20 years. It was Michael, but not as they had expected. He was kneeling, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes absent and his mouth half open. No visible injuries, not a drop of blood. Tests revealed no clinical cause of death. His wristwatch had stopped, again, at 3:03 a.m. Elliot Grayson, when informed, did not react. He just stared at the ceiling of the eye. Cell for long minutes before muttering to himself, they didn't want him. They wanted to show that they could still get through. In the prison's security system, the security cameras failed for 17 minutes, exactly the time between the start of the eclipse and Michael's death. From the corrupted recordings, technicians were able to recover only one frame. It showed the North Wing hallway empty, but in the background of the image, at the edge of the shadow, 2 silhouettes were standing. Faceless, without a shadow of their own, watching, waiting. The morning after Michael's death, the silence inside the penitentiary was almost sacred. Guards avoided the oldest hallways. Something had changed in the air, a kind of still electricity, like before a storm that you can't see but can feel. When they went to check Elliot Grayson's cell, they found the door locked, with no signs of a break-in. Inside, there was only his perfectly made bed, his desk cleared, and on it, a last page torn from one of his notebooks. Written in what looked like charcoal or dried blood, it contained a sentence. "It wasn't about me, it never was." Elliot simply disappeared. There was no way, no escape, no loophole. He was just gone. The cameras were active, but no frame captured his exit. The last video capture shows Elliot sleeping. In the next frame, the sheet is folded and the room is empty, as if it had never existed. In the mirror, a new sentence appeared hours later, as if it had slowly formed. Inside the glass itself. "Now they come for those who watch. Authorities have not commented publicly on the case. The files are sealed. Michael Lorne's body was cremated under federal order. Abigail Munro disappeared from the hospital where she was being treated. She left no trace. Just a dark stain on the ceiling of the room and the word "brings" written on the floor with her own hair. Elliot's basement recordings were destroyed, at least officially. And now only silence remains. The question. That won't go away. Could it all be a conspiracy by a brilliant psychopath, or a series of warnings ignored for decades? The cycle seems to have been interrupted. But what if it wasn't? What if someone, or something, is just waiting for a new eclipse, a new fissure, a new door to open? If you've made it this far, you may already be more involved than you realize. Subscribe to the channel to continue following the unrevealed files. Leave your comment. Do you think Elliot ran away, or was he taken? And click on the next video that is now appearing on your screen, where we will reveal the hidden documents of Victim Zero, which has never been identified until today.